Please join me in prayer. Gracious and loving God, help us this day to understand and celebrate your dream for this world, to be transformed in Jesus' love, and to use our gifts to make a difference for others. Amen. Something is afoot. New Year's can make me feel that way. I have a sense of possibility and promise, the promise of new things to be experienced. I find myself wondering what God might have in mind for me this year and all the changes the year will bring. Something is afoot. Possibility and change lie before each of us. And especially in this time at Trinity, change is upon us. Some of these changes, together or individually, happen because change happens to us. Unexpected losses, events, and just the way the attitudes and perspectives are changing in our world. And this kind of change can bring with it uncertainty and some grief and often fear. But there's also the question of how we change in life-giving ways in response to the changes around us. How do we face change? My friend Alexander Shia is a biblical scholar, though he wouldn't say it, and a psychologist. And he connects each of the four Gospels to each one has a certain question about one of life's main questions. His insight is that each of those Gospels was written in their own place and time to answer a certain underlying question that the readers would be facing. For instance, Mark was written in first century Rome. And in Rome at that time, there was great persecution of Christians. You remember Nero and all that other kind of stuff. Well, that's about when Mark was written. And Christians in Mark's community were asking, how do we move through suffering? Very different from John's situation in the Gospel of John. He's kind of part of a living, thriving community that its characters especially alive to the living presence of Jesus. And they also live in a community where they're opposed by a legalistic strain of Judaism. And so he turns that on its head, and his question is, how do we receive joy? Luke, when he was writing his gospel, seems to have been writing to Gentiles. And so his concern was these people who had never been raised with the law or the prophets or anything like that, they needed to see that accepting the faith meant changing your way of life. So the question Shia says below his gospel is, how do we mature in service? But the first gospel, Matthew, which we're going to be reading for the whole rest of this liturgical year, is different from all those other communities. It has its own story. So Matthew's community is mostly made up of Jewish people raised in the Jewish culture and life. And they have had to move, many of them, to Antioch in Syria because around the time Matthew wrote his gospel, the temple in Jerusalem had been destroyed. The Romans destroyed the center of the Jewish faith that had stood there in various states of repair for thousands of years. So here they are, they're in Antioch, and they're saying, what do we do now that the temple is gone? We don't quite know what to do. We can't go worship. We can't go to the festivals. Where is God even if there's not a temple? And for those who had started to follow Jesus, but were also from Jewish background, they were starting and wrestling with, well, what does it mean to be Jewish and be a follower of Jesus? So Shia believes the question that runs underneath the Gospel of Matthew with all of this going on is, how do we face change? This radical change. Usually the kind of question we ask when we're forced to leave some old thing behind. Matthew never specifically, none of the gospel writers specifically ask these questions. But if you listen with that ear, you can begin to hear the ways in which Jesus' good news that Matthew offers speaks to being in times of great change. So, take this story of the Magi, for instance. Story you've heard since you were growing up, probably. Now, the Magi knew that something was afoot. They were the gurus of Persia. They were the soothsayers. They were the ones who read the signs of the times, and they had seen that star rise, and they knew that something was about to happen in Israel. And so they set out. Now, here's a good thing to remember about change. The Magi did not sit around and have a focus group. They didn't have a study group. They had to go see what was happening. This great new change coming to the people of Israel. We might think that the first step in change is to become curious about what God is up to. Then be willing to set out and go see. We then read that the first stop in Israel was to see King Herod. We often interpret Magi as wise men, but I would submit to you that they're not all that savvy. Probably going to tell the current king that the new king has been born and he's going to rise up. Probably not the person you actually want to go see with this kind of news, but, let that pass a little bit. But when the king hears this news, what does the king do? Does he get curious? No. The king is fearful. He moves forward not with curiosity, but with fear. This king, pretty much like every king, didn't like the idea of losing power or feeling powerless in any way. He wanted to be in control. And he was determined to fight this change. You might remember that not long after this, he goes and kills all the children in Bethlehem, just in case. Instead of curiosity about what God is up to, that kind of anxiety can cause us to resist where God may be trying to lead forward. But the wise men, of course, make their way to Jerusalem, or to Bethlehem, and what do? They make offerings to the infant Jesus. They had responded to something afoot by going and by honoring the change and the new thing and making their offerings, even though they had no idea what that change really was. All they had was like an inkling that something new was going to happen, and yet they go. It's just a baby. The baby's not doing anything. And yet they make these offerings. The final little nugget to me about change is that they were warned in a dream. Matthew has a lot of dreams, by the way, so that's a fun little thing about Matthew. They were warned in a dream that Herod was not happy, and so they went home by another way. There's this old saying that you can't go home again. Well, this story says you can go home again. You just can't go the same way you came. You never find your way by following the same old paths. On this New Year's week, when change is in the air, we're invited to take a journey. We're invited to be curious and not fearful. We are invited to welcome this invitation with joy, even though we don't really know what's going to happen in the end. For the next few weeks, I'm going to be looking at our readings through this lens of change. What insights does the gospel have to offer each of us, and as a community, Trinity as a whole? I'm convinced that the divine is afoot. At the end of each sermon in January, I'll also be offering you questions to ponder. Maybe we'll even have the chance to share some of these thoughts with one another as we go along. Haven't figured that out yet. Stay tuned. But my questions today come from a poem by Jan Richardson. Many of you received that in your bulletin, but if you didn't, there's one after the service. And I want to read you that poem because it's a wonderful poem about new journeys. The poem is called Warning. Warning. Before you enter this terrain, there are a few things you should know. There is no entry fee, but it will cost you plenty to make this journey. Pack a lunch, lose your map, travel lightly. The weather is unpredictable. I am prone to sudden washouts, to the startling crumbling of earth. It's good to watch your step, but what is underneath is strong, and you are welcome to settle there, to rest for the night, or to stay for a season. Be careful at dusk. It's when the beasts come to the water. And it's not that they would devour you, but they are very protective of their terrain and will not easily yield. I can tell you they will never be utterly tamed, but with choice morsels and soothing words, you may have them eating from your hands. If these warnings sound harsh, good. This terrain is not for the faint of heart, for those who would travel its contours crudely, littering its landscape and stripping its soil. But I think you are made of stronger stuff and more tender, that you already know the lay of this land, how its treasures will yield to your searching fingers, how its well springs will ease your traveler's thirst, how its brambles and thorns will give way to the waiting hidden garden, where grows the sweetest, most exquisite fruit, waiting to be consumed. As we enter this new year, something is afoot. Let's take a couple of minutes in silence to rest in this moment and ponder the journey ahead. And to do that, I offer you just a few questions. In the midst of change, where do you find the earth crumbling beneath you? What is the strong surface underneath? What are the well springs that sustain you? Or whatever else this poem brings up to you as we begin this journey. So we'll take 2 minutes, and I'll invite you to quietly, simply ponder and listen.